She stood trembling at the entrance of the church, mascara running down her cheeks in thin, dark lines. No one had come to walk her in. No father. No family. Only the distant murmur of a room full of strangers and the cold silence of an empty doorway. When she looked like she might not make it through the next 5 minutes, a man she had never met, a single father who had been hired to fix a camera system on the floor above, stepped forward, placed a steady hand on her shoulder, and said quietly, "I won't let you stand here alone." No one in that building knew that his decision would not just save a wedding. It would drag a truth into the open that would leave everyone in that room completely speechless. Stay until the end of this story. What you learn about the father will be something you cannot forget. Wyatt Carter was 28 years old, and he had already learned more about responsibility than most men twice his age. He worked as a security systems technician, installing and maintaining cameras, alarm panels, and access control equipment in office buildings, hotels, and private residences across the city. It was not glamorous work. It required patience and attention to detail that most people found tedious, and the kind of calm that kept a person functional when a client was calling in a panic because their system had gone down at the worst possible moment. Wyatt had all three of those qualities in abundance. He spoke little, moved efficiently, and had a reputation among his clients for getting things done without making a fuss about it. He drove a dented pickup truck and kept his tools in a worn metal box behind the passenger seat. His apartment was clean but sparse. He did not own much that he had not earned, and he did not spend time wanting things he could not afford. The center of his life, the reason he got up before sunrise and worked overtime, and drove carefully through residential streets even when he was running late, was his daughter, Ella. Ella Carter was 6 years old. She had brown eyes that seemed too alert for her age, and a particular stillness that reminded people who met her of someone much older. She was the kind of child who watched before she spoke, who held her questions until she was sure she had formed them correctly, and who had a quiet ability to notice the emotional state of people around her that sometimes made Wyatt wonder where it had come from. He had watched her sit beside a crying neighbor in the hallway outside their apartment and say nothing at all, just sit there, close enough to be felt. The woman had calmed down within minutes. Ella had come back inside, climbed onto the couch next to her father, and asked if there was anything for dinner. She was his compass in a way he never said out loud, because saying things like that felt too large for ordinary conversation. He had been raising her alone for nearly 4 years. Ella's mother had left when Ella was just past 2 years old. There had been no dramatic ending, no final argument Wyatt could point to and say, "That was the moment." There had only been a phone call, a suitcase by the door one evening, and then an absence that grew into something permanent. Wyatt had not allowed himself the luxury of sustained bitterness. He had a child who needed him to be steady, and so he had chosen to be steady. His mornings began early, and his evenings ended late. And in between there was always something that needed his hands. He was not the kind of man who walked into a room and expected to be noticed. He was the kind of man who arrived, did what the situation required, and left before the applause started, not because he was performing humility, but because the work itself was enough. What he understood, in a bone-deep way that he never articulated, was that some people in this world did not have anyone to stand beside them when things fell apart. He had been that person once. He had promised himself, very quietly, that whenever he recognized that situation in someone else, he would not walk past it. He had no idea how soon that promise would be called in. The job had come in on a Thursday, 2 days before the event itself. The Greystone Grand Hotel, one of the city's most expensive event venues, had been scheduled to host the wedding of Charlotte Hayes and Marcus Thornton the following Saturday. Late Friday afternoon, the hotel's facilities manager had called Wyatt in a controlled panic. One section of the security camera network had gone offline, and none of their in-house technicians could identify the cause. The ceremony was set to begin at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. Could he be there by 9 in the morning? Wyatt had said yes. He always said yes to work when work was available. The Greystone Grand was not the kind of place he usually spent his Saturdays. The lobby had marble floors and fresh flower arrangements taller than he was, and every staff member moved with the particular brisk efficiency of people trained to make wealth feel effortless. He had been there twice before for smaller jobs, and both times had found himself slightly out of place, not uncomfortable exactly, but aware of the distance between the world the hotel was built to reflect and the one he came from. He arrived with Ella in tow that Saturday because his usual sitter had canceled at the last minute. Ella, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by the grandeur of the place. She held her father's hand, examined the flower arrangements with careful attention, and asked him in a hushed voice whether the people getting married had invited very many guests, because the lobby was quite full. He told her yes, quite a few. She nodded slowly, as though cataloging that information somewhere. The Hayes-Thornton wedding was, by any external measure, an event assembled with enormous care and even more money. Charlotte Hayes came from a family with a long history in the city's business circles. Her father, Richard Hayes, was the founder of a regional commercial real estate firm that had spent 3 decades building a reputation for reliability and discretion. The Thornton family, from whose side the groom came, had made their money in private equity and moved in overlapping social orbits. The guest list approached 300 people. The flowers alone had reportedly cost more than Wyatt made in a month. From where Wyatt stood, kneeling beside an equipment panel on the second floor with a flashlight in his mouth and a diagnostic tablet in his hand, the wedding looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a celebration built for people who had the means to make a day into something nobody would forget. He was focused entirely on the camera network when Ella touched his arm. "Daddy," she said softly. He looked up. "Something's wrong," she said. It was not the camera she was talking about. He followed her gaze to the window at the end of the corridor, which looked down onto the wide stone steps at the side of the building. A figure in white was standing below, half obscured by a column, shoulders moving in the unmistakable rhythm of someone trying not to fall apart in public. Wyatt set down the tablet. "Stay here," he said to Ella. She looked at him with those 2 old eyes and shook her head. "I'm coming with you." He did not argue. Inside the main hall, the atmosphere had shifted from anticipation to something brittle. The guests had been seated for nearly 20 minutes. The officiant was standing at the altar, his expression professionally neutral in a way that failed to fully conceal his uncertainty. The string quartet had cycled through their pre-ceremony repertoire twice and was now beginning a third pass, each note slightly more strained than the last. Marcus Thornton stood at the front of the room with the posture of a man who had been told not to worry and was finding that instruction increasingly difficult to follow. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of practiced confidence that came from a life in which most things had gone according to plan. His best man leaned in occasionally to say something low and reassuring that Marcus would acknowledge with a small nod and then immediately forget. At the back of the room, near the entrance vestibule, the mother of the groom was conducting a very controlled but increasingly visible panic. Patricia Thornton was 60 years old, impeccably dressed in a dove-gray gown, and her particular talent, honed over decades of navigating high-stakes social events, was the ability to express displeasure in a way that looked, to the untrained eye, exactly like gracious concern. "She was here 20 minutes ago," Patricia said to the wedding coordinator in a tone that was technically a whisper. "Someone needs to find her." The coordinator, a young woman named Dana who had been awake for 36 hours and was running on espresso and professional pride, was already moving toward the side exit, speaking quietly into her earpiece. Charlotte Hayes was not in the bridal suite. She was not in the lobby restroom. She was not with the florists, nor in the kitchen corridor where brides sometimes slipped to breathe away from the noise. She had simply stepped outside through a door at the far end of the venue that opened onto a stone terrace at the side of the building, and nobody had thought to look there because it did not appear on the venue's official floor plan. Wyatt found her before the coordinator did. She was standing against the stone wall of the building with her back to the entrance, her wedding dress catching the afternoon light in a way that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The veil had been partially pulled back, and her bouquet was held at her side, almost touching the ground, as though she had forgotten she was carrying it. Her shoulders moved with the effort of controlled breathing that had stopped being controlled some time ago. She was 26 years old, and she looked, in that moment, very young. Wyatt slowed as he approached. He did not call out. He did not announce himself. He simply moved to where she was, and stopped a few feet away, close enough that she would know she was not alone, far enough that she would not feel crowded. Ella stayed beside him, silent, her hand still in his. Charlotte turned when she heard them. Her eyes were red, and her mascara had tracked downward in the way that happens when crying stops, being something you can manage, and becomes something that simply happens to you. She looked at him at his work clothes, the faint smear of grease on his forearm, the small girl standing at his side, and for a moment she seemed too surprised to speak. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Her voice was unsteady. I'm not sure why I'm out here." Wyatt said nothing immediately. He stood in the quiet with her, the way he sometimes stood in a room where something had broken. Giving the situation a moment before, he decided what it needed. "You don't have to be sure," he said. It was a small sentence, but something about it, or perhaps about the steadiness with which he delivered it, made Charlotte's expression shift, just slightly, from the fragile blankness of someone holding themselves together by force into something closer to genuine human recognition. She looked down at Ella. Ella looked back at her calm and unhurried, the way children sometimes look at things that adults cannot quite bear to see directly. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Wyatt asked. "It came out in pieces, the way things do when a person has been holding them back long enough that the words are not quite in order anymore." Her father, Richard Hayes, had been scheduled to walk her down the aisle. It was not a question that had ever been discussed in their family. It was simply the way it would be. Richard had been present, attentive, and visibly proud throughout the entire months-long planning process. He had approved the venue. He had helped select the menu. He had stood in the church during the rehearsal 2 days earlier with his arm offered to Charlotte, and his eyes slightly too bright, in a way that she had attributed to emotion. Then, less than an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, he had knocked on the door of the bridal suite, stepped inside, and told her very quietly that he needed to leave. Charlotte had not understood at first. She had thought perhaps there had been a delay, that he needed to step out for a few minutes, make a call, handle some small thing. But her father's face had been wrong. It had the look of a man carrying something he did not want to be carrying, and the particular stillness of someone who has already made a decision they cannot explain. "He said he was sorry," Charlotte told Wyatt. "He said there was something he had to take care of. And then he left." She had called him 4 times in the 20 minutes since. He had not picked up. Wyatt listened without interrupting. He was good at that, not the kind of listening that performs itself with nods and murmurs of sympathy, but the kind that simply holds space for the thing being said, that does not rush toward a conclusion before the full shape of the thing has been given room to form. When Charlotte finished, her voice had steadied slightly from the effort of saying it out loud. She looked at him as though half expecting to be told what to do. He did not tell her what to do. "Your father not being here," he said carefully, "doesn't change who you are or what you've built. It doesn't decide whether this day belongs to you." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "Everyone in that room is waiting, and the only person who was supposed to be on my side is not here," Wyatt said. "And that is a real loss. I'm not going to pretend it isn't." She blinked. Most people, when trying to comfort someone, moved quickly toward the part where everything was fine, or would be fine, or should be treated as fine. He had not done that. "But," he continued, "you are not the first person who has had to walk into something important without the people who should have been there. And the ones who go anyway, they don't always understand why they were strong enough to do it. They just are." Ella, standing quietly at Wyatt's side the entire time, reached out and very gently touched the edge of Charlotte's dress, not grabbing, not pulling, just the lightest contact, the way a child reaches toward something beautiful and fragile. Charlotte looked down at her. "She's very gentle," Charlotte said softly. "She is," Wyatt agreed. "She gets that from somewhere that isn't me." Charlotte laughed, a small, broken sound, but a genuine one. It seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. She looked back at the building, at the door she had come through. Inside, 300 people were sitting under chandeliers, waiting for a story to begin that she had not yet decided she was ready to tell. "I don't know how to go in there," she said. Without him, Wyatt was quiet for a moment. In the years since Ella's mother had left, he had stood in many doorways that felt impossible to cross. The doorway of the pediatrician's office the first time Ella had a fever, and he was alone. The doorway of the school on her first day when she looked up at him with trust so complete it made his chest ache. The doorway of his own life, in the first months after everything changed. When the weight of going forward had been, for a time, genuinely overwhelming. "You don't need a perfect father to walk into your own life," he said quietly. "You just need to decide to go." Charlotte was still for a long moment. The afternoon light moved across the stone wall behind her. A bird called somewhere in the trees at the edge of the terrace. Then she straightened, almost imperceptibly. Something had shifted. Not resolved, not healed, but settled just enough. "Okay," she said, very quietly. "Okay." They had stood outside long enough that Dana, the coordinator, had finally found them. She appeared at the terrace door with a look of barely managed relief that shifted to confusion when she saw the man in work clothes and the small child standing beside the bride. "Miss Hayes, we need to be inside." The ceremony was supposed to begin 12 minutes ago. Charlotte looked at her, without any of the anxiety that had driven her outside. She nodded. "I know." She began to walk toward the door. Then she stopped. The image she had been pushing down came back to her, fully the empty space at her side at the top of the aisle. The place where her father was supposed to be standing. The absence that would be the first thing every person in the room saw when those doors opened. She stood with her hand on the doorframe and felt it completely. "I can't walk in alone," she said, to no one in particular. Wyatt was still a few feet behind her. He had not moved to follow. He had been thinking, in the measured way he thought through most things, about what happened next and what his part in it was. He did not make the offer lightly. He understood that it was unusual that a stranger, a tradesman who had been called in to fix a camera malfunction, had no reasonable place in a wedding ceremony between families this prominent, this carefully arranged. He understood that it would attract attention and generate exactly the kind of social disruption that people like Patricia Thornton had entire skill sets devoted to preventing. But he had made a promise to himself, a long time ago, about not walking past a person who had no one to stand beside them. "If you want," he said, "I'll walk you in." Charlotte turned to look at him. Dana's expression became briefly unreadable. "You don't have to do that," Charlotte said. "I know. You don't even know me." "No," he said. "But I know what it feels like to walk into something important and have nobody next to you." Dana pressed her earpiece. "We really need to move." Charlotte looked at Wyatt for a long moment, at his steady expression, at Ella standing calmly at his side, at the complete absence of performance or agenda in what he was offering. There was no vanity in it, no attempt to be someone's hero. There was only the simple, direct fact of a human being offering to stand beside another human being, because the alternative was that she stand alone. "Okay," Charlotte said. "Yes. Thank you." What happened next moved quickly, in the way that the minutes immediately before a ceremony always do, a compressed, slightly surreal passage in which Dana spoke rapidly into her earpiece, and Charlotte straightened her veil, and Ella was escorted to a seat near the back of the hall by a kind-faced staff member who had clearly been instructed to make the situation work regardless of its peculiarity. But when the double doors opened, and Charlotte appeared at the top of the aisle, on the arm of a man in work clothes, a man no one could identify, who belonged to neither family, the 300 guests fell into the particular silence that comes not from ceremony, but from genuine bewilderment. Patricia Thornton's face did something complicated. Marcus, at the end of the aisle, stared. Whispers moved through the rows like something running through dry grass. Wyatt did not look at any of them. He kept his eyes forward and his pace even, the way he moved through any difficult room, not as someone who had forgotten there were obstacles, but as someone who had already decided the obstacles did not apply. Charlotte held his arm and felt, for the first time that afternoon, something that was not fear. The music played. They walked. The Greystone Grand's main hall had been designed for exactly this kind of moment. The high ceilings that caught sound and suspended it, the long aisle running between rows of white chairs, the altar arrangement of cream roses and eucalyptus, serving as the visual anchor for every eye in the room. The space was built to make entrances feel significant. On this particular afternoon, it was doing exactly that, though not in any way the wedding planner had anticipated. Charlotte moved through the space, the way water moves through a channel it has found. Against expectation. Not smoothly exactly, but with a kind of inevitability. Her dress caught the light from the tall windows along the south wall. Her bouquet, which she had retrieved from where she had nearly left it on the terrace, was held steady now. Her shoulders were back. The redness around her eyes was still visible to anyone close enough, but her expression had settled into something that looked, from a distance, like a woman who had decided something. Wyatt walked beside her at a measured pace, neither hurrying nor slowing. He was aware of every face turning toward him. He was aware of the murmuring, not hostile exactly, but dense with confusion and the particular social discomfort that arises when the script of a carefully staged event is deviated from without warning. He was aware that Patricia Thornton, in the third row on the groom's side, was watching him with an expression that contained several things he could not immediately decode. He chose not to decode them. He kept walking. Ella, settled into her seat near the back with the patient attentiveness she brought to most things, watched her father move up that aisle and felt something she did not yet have a full word for, but which would, in later years, settle in her memory as the first time she understood that the bravest things people do are usually the quietest ones. At the altar, Marcus had regained the composure that the initial shock had briefly displaced. When Charlotte reached him, he took her hands with a relief so visible it seemed almost like confession. Whatever was happening, whatever the presence of the stranger who had just walked his bride to the altar meant or implied, he set it aside. He held Charlotte's hands and looked at her, and that, at least, was real. Wyatt stepped back, returned to the aisle, and found a position near the rear of the room. A member of the venue staff indicated, with a small, courteous gesture, the seat beside Ella's. He sat down. Ella leaned against his arm the way she did when she was processing something. She did not speak immediately. Then, after a moment, she whispered, "Is she going to be okay?" Wyatt considered the question with the care it deserved. He watched Charlotte at the altar, her profile turned toward Marcus, the tremor in her hands visible even from the back of the room. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. Ella nodded as though this was the answer she had expected and found it adequate. The officiant cleared his throat with commendable professionalism and began. The ceremony moved forward the words of commitment that weddings have carried for centuries. The particular formality of witnessed promises. The guests settled back into the comfortable ritual of having been given a sequence to follow. But Wyatt was not entirely settled. Something had been pulling at him since the moment he had first knelt beside the equipment panel on the second floor and found the camera network down in a pattern that had not quite made sense to him. Networks went offline for many reasons. Power failures, hardware faults, outdated firmware triggering a cascade error. He had seen all of those and learned to recognize them the way a doctor recognizes common presentations of common conditions. What he had found in the Greystone Grand system that morning had not looked like any of those things. It had looked deliberate. He had set the thought aside because the immediate situation had demanded his full attention. But now, with the ceremony underway and the room focused on the altar, the thought came back. He turned it over quietly, the way he turned over problems that had not yet given up their solution. The camera section that had gone offline covered a specific corridor on the building's east side, the same corridor that connected the main hall's service entrance to the parking structure. The same corridor that, if you were trying to move someone out of a building without being seen, you would use. He kept his expression neutral. His mind, however, had begun moving in a very different direction. The ceremony lasted just under 40 minutes. During that time, Wyatt maintained the posture of a man sitting quietly at the back of a wedding he had no formal business attending. While his attention moved between the altar and the diagnostic tablet he had quietly retrieved from the equipment bag Ella had been minding at her feet. He worked the screen with his thumb and kept it tilted below the line of the chair back in front of him. No one nearby paid him much attention. What he was examining was the camera system's event log. Not the live feed, but the historical record that every security network maintained in a secondary buffer, a rolling archive, stored independently of the main system, and that most users, and most people who might want to tamper with a system, did not think to check. The main log had been partially wiped. Someone had accessed the administrative interface within the last 12 hours and manually deleted a section of the event record. The deletion window covered a period from 11:30 that morning to approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, 45 minutes. The ceremony had been scheduled to begin at 2. That window covered the period immediately before Richard Hayes had knocked on Charlotte's bridal suite door and told his daughter he needed to leave. Wyatt opened the secondary buffer. It had not been wiped. Either the person who had accessed the system had not known it existed, likely, if they were not a professional, or they had not had time to reach it. Either way, the data was there, fragmented but recoverable. In the quiet way that data often survived, attempts to erase it by people who were determined but not technically thorough. He began reconstructing the timeline. At 11:47 that morning, a figure had entered the service corridor on the east side of the building. The camera angle was partial. The deletion had removed the cleaner footage, but the secondary buffer had caught a frame from a backup unit positioned at the stairwell junction. The figure was a man, older, walking with the unhurried pace of someone who believed he was not being observed. At 12:03, the same figure was visible in the parking structure, at the east entrance, speaking with two individuals whose faces were not visible from the available angle, but whose body language, the particular stillness of people delivering an ultimatum rather than having a conversation, was legible without needing faces. At 12:19, Richard Hayes had been seen leaving the building from the parking structure exit. Wyatt held the tablet and looked at the information for a long moment. He was not a detective. He had been hired to fix a camera malfunction, and what he had found instead was a record of something that appeared strongly, clearly to be not a malfunction at all. He thought about Charlotte outside on the terrace. He called him 4 times. He didn't pick up. He thought about the two figures in the parking structure, the body language of people delivering ultimatums. He thought about the Thornton family, the private equity background, the social weight they carried, the carefully calibrated confidence of Patricia Thornton watching him from the 3rd row as he had walked Charlotte down the aisle. The ceremony reached its midpoint. The officiant spoke about commitment and trust. Ella leaned against his arm again. "What are you looking at?" she whispered. "Something that doesn't add up," he said quietly. She considered this. "Are you going to fix it?" He did not answer immediately. Fixing a camera system was one thing. What he was looking at now was another kind of problem entirely. It was not his problem, strictly speaking. He had no stake in any of it. He was a technician from an apartment across the city who had agreed to come in on a Saturday morning and close out a service ticket. But he had seen Charlotte's face on that terrace. He had heard her say she called him 4 times. He had watched her walk into that hall on a stranger's arm because her father had been gone and she had not known why. She still did not know why. Whatever had happened in that parking structure, whatever those two figures had said to Richard Hayes, that was sufficient to pull a father away from his daughter's wedding without explanation. Charlotte deserved to know the truth of it. He put the tablet down. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm going to try." The reception period following the ceremony was, by design, the most fluid part of the event. Guests moved between the cocktail terrace and the main hall. Staff circulated with trays. The formal structure of the ceremony gave way to the comfortable disorder of a room full of people who had been sitting still for 40 minutes and were now free to move and talk and refill their glasses. Wyatt used the time. He made his way back to the second-floor equipment room with his tablet and the access credentials the hotel had provided him that morning. The backup data had given him a starting point. But starting points were not conclusions. He needed to know who had accessed the administrative interface. He needed to know what connection, if any, existed between the deleted footage window and Richard Hayes's departure. The hotel's system used a tiered access architecture, which meant that administrative commands, including the kind of selective deletion he had found required credentials at a supervisor level or above. Standard staff accounts could view the system, but could not alter the event log. To do what had been done to that log, you needed either the system administrator's password or a credential override that had been manually issued. He pulled the access audit trail. Someone had logged into the system at 11:22 that morning, using a credential that had been issued 3 days prior. A temporary override account created, according to the system record, at the request of a vendor with access to the hotel's technical management portal. The vendor account was registered to a company called Meridian Event Solutions. The contact listed was a name Wyatt did not immediately recognize. A woman named Sandra Cross. He ran the name through the professional directory he maintained, through his trade licensing subscription. Sandra Cross had no record in the database under that name. He tried a reverse lookup on the company. Meridian, its registered business address, was a commercial mailbox service in the eastern part of the city. It was a shell. The credential override had been issued by someone who had created a company specifically to obtain access to this building's system in the days before this wedding. That was not a coincidence that fit inside any innocent explanation Wyatt could construct. He thought about who had the means and motivation to arrange something like that. Creating a shell company required time and resources, but it also required someone who understood that the deletion would eventually be questioned, and who had decided that short-term operational cover was worth the risk of discovery later. That kind of calculation suggested someone accustomed to managing risks of this nature. It suggested someone in the habit of treating problems as transactions. He thought about the Thornton family. He thought about private equity, the analysis of risk and return, the identification of assets, the management of obstacles to completion. And then something connected. The Hayes family business, the commercial real estate firm Richard had spent 30 years building, had been in the news 8 months ago. Wyatt had not followed the story closely, but he remembered it the way you remember things that pass through your peripheral awareness. A dispute over a major development deal, a contentious negotiation, a suggestion that the Hayes firm was being pressured to accept terms its founder considered deeply unfair. The Thornton family's private equity connections operated in the commercial property sector. A wedding between the Hayes family and the Thornton family, preceded by a hostile business negotiation between the two. A father removed from his daughter's ceremony, at a critical moment, through what appeared to be an organized, premeditated operation. Security footage deleted to remove the evidence. This wedding was not just a celebration. It was, or had been intended to be, a consolidation. The merger of two prominent families through marriage with the implicit social and legal entanglements that followed was the kind of arrangement that could significantly alter the power dynamic in an ongoing business dispute. If the Hayes family was tied to the Thorntons through marriage, walking away from a bad deal became considerably more complicated when the other party was also your in-law. And if Richard Hayes had figured that out, If he had arrived at that understanding that morning and confronted someone in the Thornton orbit with what he knew, then someone in that orbit had a very strong motivation to remove him from the picture before he could share that understanding with his daughter. Wyatt looked at the data on his tablet one last time. He had enough. Not everything. Not the full legal architecture of whatever had been arranged in that parking structure, but enough of the shape of it. Enough to bring what he knew into the room downstairs, and let the people who deserved the truth decide what to do with it. He closed the tablet, tucked it under his arm, and went to find Charlotte. The cocktail reception had migrated into the ballroom adjacent to the ceremony hall. The long tables were immaculately set. Guests moved in the relaxed clusters of a celebration, finding its rhythm glasses in hand, conversations beginning to layer over the formal distance of the ceremony into something warmer and less structured. Charlotte was near the center of the room, standing with Marcus and 3 people Wyatt did not recognize. She was smiling the kind of smile that takes effort after crying, that is held in place by will as much as feeling, but that is also, in its imperfection, genuine. Marcus was beside her with one hand at the small of her back. Wyatt moved toward her with the deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is committed to that decision without being aggressive about it. He understood that what he was about to do would change the atmosphere of the room. He understood it could not be undone once done. He reached Charlotte and waited until she turned to him naturally. In the pause between conversations, "Can I speak with you for a moment?" he said, keeping his voice low. "And Marcus. It should be both of you." Charlotte looked at him, at whatever was in his expression, and nodded. Something in the way she nodded told him she had already understood. Without being told that what he was about to say, they moved to a quieter corner near the windows overlooking the hotel's terrace garden. Wyatt laid out what he had found in plain, measured language. The deleted footage, the shell company account used to access the system, the secondary buffer data showing Richard Hayes's departure and the interaction in the parking structure, the connection to Meridian Event Solutions and the absence of any legitimate business record for that company, the context of the ongoing commercial dispute between their 2 families. He did not editorialize. He did not tell them what to conclude. He described what he had found, described what the timeline appeared to show, and stopped. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. His expression was the stillness of someone processing something that is arriving from an unexpected direction and requiring rapid reassessment. "Where did you find this?" Marcus asked. Wyatt told him. "And you're sure it's connected to?" Marcus stopped. He seemed to be recalibrating what he was willing to say out loud. "I'm not certain of anything," Wyatt said. "I found a pattern in the data, and I'm telling you what the pattern looks like. What you do with it is your decision." Charlotte had not spoken during any of this. She was looking at the tablet screen at the time-stamped frames from the secondary buffer, at the access log entry for the shell company, at the partial image of her father standing in the parking structure, with 2 figures whose faces were not visible, but whose posture was entirely legible. He didn't abandon her. He had been pushed out. Something in her face moved from the place it had been sitting all afternoon, the complicated grief of a daughter who had not been chosen into something sharper and more focused, and in its own way more painful, because it was the pain of understanding rather than the pain of confusion. She looked up from the tablet. Across the room, Patricia Thornton was watching them. She was doing it with the smooth, social deflection of someone practiced in the art of not appearing to watch. But her eyes returned to Charlotte's corner with a frequency that, once you noticed, was impossible to unsee. Charlotte straightened. "I want to talk to her," she said quietly. Wyatt said nothing. This was not his call to make, and he knew it. Marcus touched Charlotte's arm. "Charlotte, I'm not asking for permission," she said. Not unkindly, but clearly. She walked across the ballroom floor with the kind of purpose that comes from having processed a thing fully and decided the processing is finished. Patricia Thornton read her approach and adjusted her expression into the precise configuration of welcoming concern she had been deploying all day. Charlotte stopped in front of her. "I know what happened this morning," Charlotte said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Several people nearby fell quiet, something in the quality of her tone signaling, "This is not a conversation you should talk over." Patricia's expression shifted through 3 distinct configurations in the space of approximately 2 seconds, before settling into something careful and cool. "Charlotte, today has been a great deal for everyone. My father did not leave," Charlotte said. "He was removed. And I need you to tell me why." The room, in the way that rooms do when the temperature changes, became quieter. Not silent, there was still music. Still the clink of glasses. Still conversation at the far end, but in the immediate radius of the 2 women. An attention had gathered that had nowhere else to go. Patricia held Charlotte's gaze. "This is not the place," Patricia said. "No," Charlotte agreed. "It isn't. But I'm not waiting for the right place anymore." What followed was not a screaming match. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more devastating. Patricia Thornton did not confess. She maneuvered. She deployed the fluent social vocabulary of a woman who had spent decades managing difficult situations through displacement and redirection, suggesting that Charlotte was overwrought, that the day had been stressful, that they should speak privately, that making a scene would hurt only Charlotte herself. Charlotte listened to all of it. She let every word land and said nothing until Patricia had finished. Then she turned to Marcus. "Did you know?" she asked. Directly, without softening the question, Marcus looked at his mother, then at Charlotte. The answer was in the looking and the particular geometry of his gaze, in the way it moved between them before settling, with evident effort, on his bride. "I knew there was a business conversation happening," he said. "I didn't know it went this far." Charlotte nodded slowly. It was possible he was telling the truth. It was possible that what had been arranged that morning had been arranged at a level above him, that he had been as much a piece in the arrangement as she had been, and as unaware of the full scope of it. It was possible that the look on his face was genuine. It was also possible that possibility was not enough. "I need to know," Charlotte said quietly, "whether this marriage was your choice or someone else's." The silence that followed had weight. Marcus began to speak, she thought, to say something real, something that might have reached her, but before he finished, she felt a certainty settle in her chest that regardless of the answer, she was not ready to receive it right now. Not in this room, not surrounded by 300 people who had been assembled to witness a narrative she had not written and not yet had the chance to understand. She turned to face the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room was already watching. "I'm going to pause this," she said. "I am not ending my relationship. I am not making an accusation. I am saying that I have just learned something I did not know before today, and I am not willing to make permanent decisions while I am still learning the shape of it." Someone near the back of the room started to speak, then stopped. "My father was removed from this building this morning," Charlotte continued, "so that he would not be here to tell me something. I don't know exactly what that was, but I'm going to find out, and until I do, I am asking everyone here to please give Marcus and me the space to have that conversation in private." She looked at Patricia Thornton once more. "I am not angry," she said. "I am clear." Then she picked up her bouquet from the table where she had set it and walked toward the hallway door. Wyatt had not moved from where he was standing near the windows. He had watched the entire exchange with his arms at his sides and his expression quiet. When Charlotte passed near him on her way out, she stopped. She looked at him for a moment. There were no more tears. Whatever grief had been driving them had been replaced, for now, with something more controlled and more focused. "Thank you," she said. It was a small sentence, but the way she said it contained the full weight of the afternoon, the terrace and the empty aisle and the truth sitting inside a backup buffer. waiting for someone with the patience to find it. Wyatt nodded once. Ella appeared at his elbow, having navigated across the room, with the quiet efficiency she brought to most things. She looked up at Charlotte. Charlotte looked down at her. "Is she going to be okay?" Ella asked the same question she had posed an hour ago, in a different tone, in a different world. Charlotte smiled. It was the most genuine expression she had managed all day. "Yes," she said. "I think she is." Richard Hayes was found that evening at a hotel 2 miles away, not hiding, not fleeing, but sitting in a room with his phone face down on the desk, and the particular posture of a man who has done something he cannot undo, and is not yet sure what comes next. He had been approached that morning by 2 representatives from a Thornton-affiliated investment firm. They had presented him, in the careful language of people who know how to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints, with a set of terms. The business dispute between the Hayes firm and Thornton Investments had been moving toward litigation for several months. What had been proposed in that parking structure was a resolution, not a legal one, but a social one. Richard would step back from the dispute. He would allow the development deal to proceed under the terms the Thornton side had been pushing. In exchange, the marriage would proceed without incident, and certain information that could damage the Hayes firm's reputation, information that would take years to repair, would remain private. He had left the building because he did not know how to tell his daughter that her wedding had been used as leverage against him. He had not picked up her calls because he had not yet found a version of the truth that felt survivable to say out loud. Charlotte drove to that hotel alone that evening. She sat with her father in the room, with the phone still face down on the desk, and listened to everything he had been unable to say that morning. When he finished, she did not speak for a long time. The room held the quiet of 2 people who have arrived at the raw edge of something and have not yet decided whether to cross it or step back. She did not forgive him that night. Forgiveness, she understood, was not something that happened in a single conversation. It was something that grew slowly, if it grew at all, out of repeated small decisions to keep the door open. But she stayed. She sat with him in the imperfect and complicated truth of who he was, and what he had done, and what it had cost both of them. That, for now, was enough. In the weeks that followed, the story moved in directions that neither Charlotte nor Wyatt had scripted. The Thornton family's involvement in the removal of Richard Hayes from the wedding was documented and became the subject of a legal inquiry connected to the underlying business dispute. Marcus, to his credit, cooperated fully with that process. The wedding was postponed. The relationship between Marcus and Charlotte entered a longer, slower chapter 1 that had not yet reached its ending when this story closes. Wyatt returned to his apartment that Saturday evening, with Ella asleep against his shoulder, her face slack and trusting in the way of children who have decided the person carrying them is safe. He laid her in bed, tucked the blanket around her, and stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. He had not saved anyone's marriage. He was not sure he had saved anyone's life. What he had done was stand beside a person who needed someone to stand beside her, and then found a truth that deserved to be known, and brought it to the people who deserved to know it. That was the shape of it. Simple, when you stripped away everything else. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and looked out the window at the city settling into evening. Somewhere across that city, Charlotte Hayes sat with her father in a quiet hotel room and learned how to begin the slow work of deciding what came next. She was not alone in it. That was not everything, but it was where everything started.